Hello, Garland Nixon. It is a new year and we got a lot to learn. And what better person to teach us than Mark Sleboda? Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and it's a new year. We got a lot to talk about. Of course, we're going to take a look at some point in this show at Boosty.to, Mark Sleboda's great channel. But before we get there, we got lots of things to talk about. Mark, let me throw this at you and we'll get going. Provocations. I think we all know what we're talking about. They seem to be coming fast and fierce. They ain't slowing up. It's not a provocation. This is provocation season. And you know, I'm always the hesitant guy. And here's the way I feel. Throw it at you, because I know there's a lot of people that feel the opposite. I feel like the real thing that they're pissed at, one of the real things that they're pissed at Putin about in the West is that he won't take the bait. That they want him to throw a missile at Brussels or London or something so they can then say, Article 5, Trump, everybody look at what we do about it. And that Putin's like, the way to win this war is to win a war. We're going to knock the hell out of Ukraine. We're going to take Ukraine, and then you're going to be screwed. And then everybody's going to look at you and say, hey, you told us that, and they were going to let blah, blah. And that's my feelings. Let me throw it at you, Mark, because I know there's a lot of people in Russia. They want blood. They want it now. Anyway, your thoughts, Mark.
Yeah. So first, with regard to the provocations, David Ignatius warned us in the Washington Post, last year, earlier last year, that with the Kiev regime, shall we say, losing on the battlefield, that they were turning to what he called the dirty war, right? And that it was just starting. Well, the dirty war has actually been going on for some time, but I agree that in their desperation, they are turning to it more and more. And we can call it asymmetric warfare. We can call it unconventional warfare, dirty war, whatever you want to call it. But from the attacks on civilian shipping in the Black Sea, in the Med, the Atlantic, right? Everyone who trades with Russia, with a drone attempt to assassinate Putin, the attacks on the oil refineries, the car bombings of generals, that sort of thing. That is going to be, I think, the big story going into this year as the war progresses. Because as Russia continues on the battlefield with success after success, the Kiev regime will have to demonstrate victory, both of a sort, both for the regime, its troops' own morale, but also to continue the flow of weapons from the West, and that's just going to be a necessity. It's what they can do, and it's what they will do. And I also agree with you that Russia is not responding to these provocations, at least not on a quid pro quo escalatory basis. And I think you're right that it is part of the calculus of the Kiev regime, of the European political elite, of a considerable portion of the U.S. government in all its various forms, the deep state, everyone except for a small cadre within the Trump administration around Trump. And even then, that's frankly questionable. We learned in the New York Times this week, just in the last 24 hours, a story came out that fessing up that the U.S. has been behind all of these oil refinery attacks in Russia, that they were providing the direction, the satellite guidance, everything. This was their essentially, let's call it what it is, because ultimately, if the U.S. is doing this, then Trump is responsible for it, right? We have to acknowledge that. Either that, or we just admit that he's an incompetent, powerless president, completely not able to control his own security apparatus. And in which case, it doesn't make any difference as far as Russia's concerned, right?
If I may
They
throw
have
some, if I may throw in a quick comment on that. Well, we do know one thing we know, and that is historically the CIA is very rogue. So what the CIA does is not necessarily elements of the CIA. In that, if the president goes too far from them, even he can become a point of attack. So the other thing I will say is this: I don't think that when these things happen, it's guaranteed that Trump was in on it, or even if the New York Times says Trump was in it, we still don't know. Though, you know what I mean? Anyway, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to wonder what the hell is Tulsi Gabbard doing as director of national intelligence if the CIA is completely rogue like that. But
Which I think
whether this is a conscious game of Trump's to present himself as a mediator trying to bring peace. Oh, the deaths, it's so sad. We have to end this senseless war. While trying to stick the Russians into accepting an end to the conflict on American terms that would preserve a Banderite fascist proxy regime in Kiev. Whether we believe that, or whether we believe that this is the CIA doing their own thing and Trump really can't control them, for the Russians, it doesn't make any difference, right? If you want to believe in Trump and that he's an incompetent, powerless do-gooder, at least in this particular instance, I mean, go for it. It's not impossible, right? I'm saying for the Russians, it doesn't make a difference because they have to deal with what the U.S. does, not what Trump says.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Ultimately, it's and that's very Russian, which is very, very practical, bureaucratic, which is to say, ultimately, it is. I always talk about what is it, Socrates versus Plato, or Socrates versus whoever it is, Aristotle. The is reality what we think and believe and consider, and narratives, or is reality what I can see and touch and feel? And the Russians have to deal with a reality that no matter what the narrative, and no matter what you think or guess, if I got a bomb blowing up, and ultimately, what is the ultimate priority of the Russians? The ultimate priority is this. These people are trying to come to our border and threaten us physically. And now that they've lost, they want to preserve this thing that they use to, you know what I mean? Ultimately, it comes down to this. They've lost, and they know they lost. So now, how do we preserve the Banderite regime? How do we preserve a military element, an intelligent element that we can continue to use to attack with the Russians with? And the Russians' position has to be, we can't let you do that. And I think that's, now that they've lost the war, that's where we are at that point. How do we preserve this thing that we use against the Russians? And the Russians saying, we ain't gonna let you preserve it. And that's where we ultimately we're gonna come to at some point.
Yeah, that's where it is. In fact, I would say, to a certain extent, on a diplomatic level, they're even playing to the narrative Trump, largely still, right? I mean, but they're not letting that diplomatic game influence what they're doing on the battlefield in Ukraine at all, right? They're two separate tracks. So maybe that's Russia recognizing the divergence, if you want to say that there is one in the U.S. government, and dealing with it that way. But regardless, I mean, that is, if an attack on Putin, right, is only ushering in the new year, well then what is to come? right? Chemical weapons, false flags, all of these things are entirely possible. And ultimately, yes, part of the calculation is to uh, bring the U.S. directly into the conflict, perhaps with a provocation that Russia responds to, perhaps with a false flag, but to give the Trump administration, which does seem to some degree to at least to want to distance itself from this conflict, and the Europeans and the Kiev regime, want to do the opposite. And that's what we're going to see. Russia's response, I think you're right again, is they want to stay inside an escalatory box that operates under the current rules of this proxy war, very similar to previous proxy wars between Russia or the Soviet Union and the US, that operates under certain rules. And they're winning comfortably, right, at their own pace inside that box. And as long as they stay in that box, then there's not the risk of them being outside that space where they're not winning handily. For instance, if they responded to this attack by killing Zelensky or firing an Oreshnik at one of the military bases in Germany where equipment is staged by the West for the Kiev regime, that would put them outside that box. That would be an escalation that would far more than likely bring the West directly into this conflict, and that would change it. And while I sincerely believe that Russia has the capability to win a conventional conflict against NATO in Ukraine at the current moment, Russia doesn't want to risk that. And Russia seems to be far more cautious and cognizant of the fact that even if they were winning that, there's that slippery slope down to nuclear escalation, that they, being the only adults in the room in this situation, are at great pains to avoid anything that could lead down that path to that slope. So, how is Russia going to respond to an assassination attempt on Putin? Now, first of all, I have to say that I do not believe for a second that the West was not involved in this. The Kiev regime is not capable of carrying out that type of attack without the satellite intelligence and guidance that would be necessary at a distance to hit the Russian presidential state residence in Novgorod. On top of this, that state residence in Novgorod has an underground facility that is a nuclear war command center, right, from which the Russian president could give orders, equivalent to, let's say, the U.S. president on Air Force One, or facilities in Virginia that he might be taken to. So that, in effect, is also targeting an essential command and control part of Russia's nuclear triad. Again, right? So that is a huge escalation again in that respect. And particularly if the West was involved. Now, it could have been the United Kingdom. That is a possibility. The UK has been very fervent, trying to be the tail that wags the dog and incite further escalation all through this conflict. If you'll remember, the first Western country to send tanks to the Kiev regime was the UK sending the Challengers. Not that they did the Kiev regime any good whatsoever, right? But they were the one pushing the envelope. They were the first ones to send cruise missiles right, to the Kiev regime, the Storm Shadows. They have been very openly directing the conflict in the Black Sea. This Admiral Radikin, taking, like, yes, we've beaten the Russians in the Black Sea kind of stance openly in the Western press. So it could be they would have the satellite capability necessary to do that. But I find it also entirely possible that the U.S. was involved in this. The timing is extremely suspicious. Now, Putin is spending most of his time at his apartment in the Kremlin, but they seem to have gotten the intelligence that he was in Novgorod, right, at that time for the presidential at the presidential state residence there. Perhaps for the holidays. I don't know. Now, this is all it. This attack occurred while Trump was meeting with Zelensky in the White House. But before that and after that, Trump called Putin. He called Putin and talked for an hour before Trump talked to Zelensky, and then he was like, well, okay, so I'll call you back in 2 or 3 hours when I'm done talking to Zelensky. It is entirely possible that the Americans, through that phone call, were able to positively determine where the Russian president was. They could presume that he would probably stay in the same place, right, for the next few hours, while Trump would ostensibly be talking to Zelensky. And that's when the attack happened. So there's a lot of Russian analysts, the Russian Telegram channels that are operating under the assumption that that this was yet another type of diplomatic ruse, much like Trump was involved with Iran, facilitating the Israeli attack as a surprise attack beforehand. So there's a pattern here. If so, that is a very dangerous escalation. Even if the U.S. was not involved in this attack, I cannot seriously believe for 1 second that they didn't know about it. Because the New York Times has told us repeatedly that the U.S. is in absolute control of Ukrainian intelligence, and it's the SBU and the GUR, the Ukrainians' intelligence and military intelligence, that are responsible for formulating these type of long-range strikes, right? That's who does it. We're told this quite proudly that the CIA came into Ukraine immediately after 2014, took over the Kiev regime's intelligence and military intelligence, rebuilt them from the ground up in their own image, then built a whole series of CIA bases from which to run covert ops into Russia, right on the Russian-Ukrainian border. And that an entire floor of the SBU, the Kiev regime's main intelligence building, was preserved for the United States, and another floor for the UK, by the way. So I do not believe for a second that the Kiev regime launched 91 long-range strike drones without intelligence, satellite data from some Western country, and without the U.S., at least the CIA. And again, we can pretend that Trump is some kind of cipher in the White House who has no ability to control or do anything if you want. It doesn't make a difference to the Russians because they have to deal with what the U.S. government is doing. So ultimately, the U.S. either knew about this They facilitated it or they directed it. Take your choice. Whatever Trump may claim about, outrage and how shocked he is, and boy, it's sure lucky I didn't give them tomahawks, huh? I mean, not that the tomahawks would have done any better than the drones, but that's that puts Russia in a very tough position. Now, I believe that they are not going to hit Zelensky. They're not even going to hit the Ukrainian government, at least, not a body like the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, or specific ministers. And they're certainly not going to strike in Europe at anyone or the United States. They're going to stay inside that escalatory box. And from their perspective, they have to say, why would they risk going outside of that? Yeah, they launched 91 drones, and we brought them all down well before they could have even reached the Russian president's state residence in Novgorod. So they may not feel a need to. They may feel a political need to respond in a forceful way. We don't know exactly how they're going to respond yet. I've heard some chatter about an absolutely enormous drone and missile attack being prepared. That would be the largest one thus far. But then again, we've seen several of those in the past couple of months where Russia keeps adding more and more drones as they have more and more. They're approaching 1,000 Garan long-range strike drones a day being made and available for use. There is the possibility that now, with confirmation that the Oreshnik, Russia's new hypersonic ballistic missile that was used last year once against the military-industrial complex in Ukraine, right? The one that Russia is saying is basically a conventional weapon of mass destruction, at least when used in clusters. They could use that, and that would definitely make a statement about the seriousness with which they treat this. But what would they target? They could target the Kiev regime's intelligence, wherever they are currently hiding themselves, right? I'm sure Russia knows. They could do that. And they will almost certainly hit drone facilities, right? Facilities that make drones and facilities that operate them. Maybe even the ones that actually operated this attack. Now, Russia's hit them many times before, and they'll hit them again, right? You destroy one and they pop up another one, right? That's this game of whack-a-mole, at least. But I agree with you. I don't think that Russia is going to escalate outside of that box, right? It could also be more hits on energy infrastructure. They could they have the capability now. They're within one large salvo of completely blacking Ukraine out for more than a temporary basis. They could do that.
Blackout Kiev. Yeah, blackout Kiev for months.
Yeah,
and this time in January, that's going to be a problem.
They're blacking out Kiev regularly now, but on a temporary basis, where it's blacked out for a few hours and then they're able to institute enough repairs. But Russia they are within the damage threshold that they could deliver a blow, not just to Kiev, but to the Kiev regime's electrical infrastructure as a whole, where most of the country could be plunged into permanent darkness and cold in the middle of winter, right? Because water, heating are still largely, a province of the electrical infrastructure, the electrical energy. So that is another possibility that they could do that as well. I tend to believe that they're not going to choose to respond to this attack that way because the electrical infrastructure is dual use, yes, but that could be seen then as responding against the civilian population to punish what the Zelensky regime did by trying to assassinate Putin. But they may rationalize things differently. They may do things differently. I don't know. But we are going to see a response. It's going to be a big response. We've heard that, yes, it will be non-diplomatic. The targets have already been selected. And I would presume that it will be certainly within a week, right? They're not going to wait any longer than that. Obviously, it was unlikely they were going to launch it on New Year's Eve. That would be a little crass maybe, but we will see a response, and then we can debate whether it was strong enough to deter further such incidences or not. I don't believe so. I don't believe there's anything they could do that will deter such dirty war attacks in the future. But
yeah, well, a couple of things that, and I took a little note. No, one of the reasons is this: terrorism is the tactics of the weak. So the West, the NATO demonstrates its weakness. It's like, we can't do anything on the battlefield. So the only thing we'll do is, wait till you turn your head and smack you in the back of the head and then say we didn't do it or something like that. Right. So you're right. It doesn't deter it, because the reason it's happening is because specifically they're losing. I would say this. I think one of the things that Russia understands is this very well. Their strength is that they control the escalatory ladder. They control escalations. Absolutely. If they then throw a missile at Berlin or wherever the hell outside, right? Then they have to wait and see what the other side does. So they don't control, as long as everything that happens, they punch in Ukraine. No matter what you do, I'm going to keep punching Ukraine. Well, we'll do this, then I'm going to punch Ukraine again. They have basically, I think they've determined at some point, whatever they do to us, we're going to take it out on Ukraine. For this reason, because that's where our victory is, because that's what the pain of the West, the thing that really determines the future, the future for Russia, the future for NATO is Ukraine. You win, it's kind of like you watch a boxing match and some guy opens a cut, right? And he just keeps hitting that cut. He may be able, and a guy may like open another area, please hit me here or whatever. I'm going to keep hitting that cut because that's going to bleed so much. That's where the referee's going to stop it. And they understand they're going. And I think that's what the Russians, no matter what they do, the provocation, they're going after Ukraine. That is where the victory is. And I'll say this, even in this world right now, the true, and some of the neocons understand it. The true pain for NATO, the true pain for the EU, that there's all of these people around the world in the global south, all looking at Ukraine, just waiting. And at some point, when it's clear that the Russians have won, the whole empire and colonial powers at that point are delegitimized in a way that a lot of them know, but a lot of people, you know what I mean? In Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, everywhere. What happens with this whole Taiwan argument and this, we're going to do this, and all of these other suckers that they're trying to gear up, saying, let's get you full of weapons so you can stand up against China or whoever the hell. These countries then look over at the fate of Ukraine and say, we got to start asking some questions. So I think the Russians understand, the Russian leadership understand in a way that a lot of people that don't understand, that the entire world will not be the same when the colonial powers are defeated in Ukraine. It changes. It's the time that like 100 years, 500 years from now, people will look back and say, the day the Americans and NATO lost in Ukraine, the world took a right turn or a left turn or whatever it is.
Yeah, At the beginning of every one of my weekly weekend reviews, I punch home that ultimately this conflict is very likely to be a world order changing conflict in the end game of it, right? We're already there. And we've seen the US, the Europeans, they acknowledge this, right? We've heard multiple times, that from Mark Milley, the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and others, right, that they believe that U.S. leadership is on the line. U.S. leadership, quote unquote, right? And they've said very similar things, right?
What's his name?
call that
Bojo
what
said
it
it. Bojo
Yeah.
said it. Remember?
Bojo. Yeah, Bojo said he actually said the words that Western hegemony, that U.S. hegemony is on the line. He said those words, and we can translate U.S. global leadership, meaning U.S.-led Western global hegemony, because ultimately, to not 100%, right? Power. There are hard facets of power that matter to it as well, but there is also a narrative element, an element of belief, right? You have to believe and fear the hegemon. And if someone shows successful resistance in such a big way, then that fear, that belief in the power and control of the hegemon is gone. And we've seen this from actually going back since the beginning of this conflict. When we see protesters in Africa, in the Sahel and other states flying the Russian flag, are they doing it because they support the SMO in Ukraine? No, not per se. They are using it as a symbol of resistance against the West. They are attaching their neo-colonial resistance against France and other Western colonial powers in Africa. And they see Russia effectively resisting that West. And therefore, it becomes a symbol to them of defiance. And smart people, right? And there are smart people within the CIA, within the deep state, within the bowels of Langley and everything. They understand how dangerous this is to them. And they cannot allow Russia to be seen as winning, right? Whether Russia wins and they have to somehow successfully spin it, i.e. positioning the U.S. as some kind of third-party arbiter and taking a step back, or whether, of course, their preference would be simply that Russia does not win, at least what everyone would recognize as winning, that it's going to be a body blow to U.S. hegemony. It's not going to bring the whole thing down, but it is seriously going to damage that rotten edifice in a way that is going to facilitate the eventual collapse of it. And we've seen Russia actually now, in the last 2 decades, in 3 conflicts, inflict blows on that. The first one was the proxy war in Georgia in 2008 with the U.S.-backed strongman that seized power in the country, Mikhail Saakashvili. A small war, just a few days, right? But just like with Ukraine, Georgia then, at that time, was a clear U.S. proxy, although they've obviously emerged from that dark shadow now. The second one was in Syria, which was a much more in your face, because the U.S. was obviously moving towards direct regime change against Assad under Obama, until Russia stepped in and dropped their troops in Syria and said, hey, we're here, right? And we're protected. Now, ultimately, Russia won on the ground, but then lost the peace as U.S. sanctions hauled out the Syrian economy, the Syrian government, and allowed the whole military to be co-opted and just basically fade away within a few weeks. But
I think
Russia,
the jury's still out on that, because there's a resistance forming. Russia's still there. The jury, talk to me in a few years and see. I think the jury's out on Syria.
I'll drink to that. I'll drink to that.
Well, in that case, right now, let's hear something that everybody can celebrate. It's Boosty.to, Mark Sleboda. We're up to 277 subscribers, and we got
that was awful. That was an awful segue, Garland.
Yeah.
That was an awful segue.
Well, it's the best I can do. It's the best we can do on short notice. But it ain't much, but it's all we got for a segue right now. Mark, tell everybody it's boosty.to/the real politique. Mark Sleboda. Tell people what this is and what how they join, why they should join, all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a Russian living in Russia, which means I'm under Western sanctions, which means that credit cards, the standard Patreon, YouTube, Buy Me a Coffee, Substack, none of them work for me, right? So, but Boosty is sanctions proof, right? Boosty is essentially a Patreon clone, right? That is sanctions proof. So that's why I've set up shop there. If you want to support me, if you want lots of exclusive content that I put out hours worth every week just for the subscribers there, please do so. So that's where you can follow all of my work. I'll put this video there. That's available for everyone. I've also got exclusive content I do, but that's where I've set up shop. So if you want more of my cynicism and fatalism and realism, that's the place to do it.
All right, everybody, Mark Sleboda, and you'll find, if you look there, all of his various, if you want to see what he's doing, all of his, like for instance, Crosstalk, RT, all of his variant appearances, and you can interact with Mark. So it's a great place to go. It's boosty.to/the real politique with Mark Sleboda. All right, Mark, one of the things that I think we always do when we talk, and that is this: we recognize this, that we're in a reality where the things that you can touch and feel are very important. The narrative is great, and we enjoy talking about it. But ultimately, what is driving this madness, on this desperation, and this terrorism? What's happening on the battlefield? I understand things ain't going so well, and a lot of towns falling. I mean, a lot of towns falling, it seems to me.
Yeah. So I would say that, the two most important recent ones that fell are Gulai Polya, which is in the eastern Zaporozhye region, and that one was somewhat quite unexpected. We've also seen Stepnogorsk in the western Zaporozhye region fall. Russia's just racing through Zaporozhye, right? They are already within 15 kilometers. Count them. 15 kilometers of Zaporozhye city itself, right? That's how close they are. Part of what people are saying is that Zaporozhye city, right, when you talk in agglomeration, right, that means urban areas that more or less roll into each other, like Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, right, were technically separate settlements, small city settlements, but in operational terms, they were more or less part of one big urban agglomeration. It's the same thing with a number of small towns that basically roll into Zaporozhye, and Russia is already on the outskirts of that outer town that you could consider part of the urban agglomeration. So the battle for Zaporozhye city could, by some standards, already be considered to be starting now, right? So that's very significant there, because that Zaporozhye is a major industrial center for the Kiev regime, and if Russia takes that, that will basically collapse everything west or everything east of the Dnieper River and south of Kharkov. That would collapse. It would also give Russia the type of solid crossing of the Dnieper River that it could then move on Nikolaev and Odessa, right? They could cross there and then move south to Nikolaev and Odessa. So it would be, I expect to see Russia moving on Zaporozhye in a big way by the tail end of next year, right? They'll be moving on Zaporozhye in a big way. The other perhaps big thing is Russian forces in the Donbass region. The advancements they're making in Konstantinovka and Liman, but also there in the southern Kharkov region, there is a big fog of war about what is actually happening in Kupiansk, which Russia took at the end of November, but then the Kiev regime launched a let's strip every other front and throw in the kitchen sink counter offensive in that area, and pressed Russia hard in December. And we don't know how. We don't know. I don't myself know what percentage of Kupiansk city Russia holds and what's part the Kiev regime holds of this part. I honestly can't tell you. I hear contradictory things, and all of the evidence is not conclusive. But I can tell you that it seems that the Kiev regime's counteroffensive has run out of steam. So Russia seems to be now pushing back, however back they were pressed from it. And effectively what we're seeing now is a sixth battle for Kupiansk in this war, which is just crazy, but that's actually what we're on there. Taking Kupiansk is going to be necessary. The next domino after Kupiansk is Izium, and that is the northern gateway to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which is the last of that Kiev regime's last defense, the top of that Kiev regime's last defensive line in the Donbass region, which Russia will be moving on by the summer. Again, by some standards, if you want to talk a wider agglomerated area, Russia is already moving on Slavyansk now from Seversk, which they took a few weeks ago, a very important stronghold there. So it's all coming to a head. The Donbass will be settled this year, probably, definitely by the autumn. But that is that southern Kharkov region taking Kupiansk is what's going to facilitate closing the supply lines from the north to that last defensive line in the Donbass.
Now, let me ask you this. If we look at Zaporozhye, right, the other part of it, taking Zaporozhye or somewhere, does the Kiev regime, do they use the river to move goods up to the Dnipro and up to Kiev? I mean, because at that point, if they take Zaporozhye, they own the river, they close the river off. Is that a important artery for the Kiev regime, for their country?
No, it's not. You have to remember, first of all, the Kakhovka Reservoir Dam was blown up a couple of years ago in this conflict,
right?
Which caused a lot of problems there. So that is not a major artery. The actual artery, of where things are brought in is Odessa, right?
Okay. Yes.
That's where the Kiev regime gets goods out and gets armaments in, is through Odessa. But again, if Russia takes Zaporozhye, that will allow them to cross the Dnieper and move on Nikolaev and then Odessa from that point. So that's why it would be important. But that would be no sooner than 2027 if the conflict lasts that long.
It also seems that they've really stepped up their strikes on Odessa now. That Odessa for a while was off. And so now they are, okay, a lot of stuff may come in at Odessa, but they're hitting ships and ports with stuff. And
yes.
They're hitting ports, they're hitting trains. So now, rather than Odessa being kind of an unmolested hub for the activity, for supplies, life's getting harder and harder. And they're even cutting down the power. And so bridges, even though they haven't taken Odessa, it's getting very difficult to utilize that as a hub for commercial activity and military activity, isn't it?
Absolutely. So this is a response. This is a direct response to the Kiev regime, and because the West helps them with everything, the attacks on civilian shipping, right? The oil tankers and other. There was even a sunflower oil tanker hit for whatever reason, simply because it's Russian. This was Russia's response to that, right? Because ultimately, all of those surface drone attacks, everything that happens in the Black Sea is directed out of Odessa. And Putin warned, if you attack our civilian shipping again, then we are going to shut Odessa down. And that's what they're doing, right? They attack more civilian shipping, and Russia is shutting Odessa down. They're attacking the Western ships bringing arms in port. They're attacking the ports. They're attacking the warehouses. They're attacking the electrical infrastructure, without which, the port becomes useless, right? You can't get things that are in and out of it. They're not only hitting Odessa, but they're hitting the two smaller ports also in the Odessa region there, Izmail and Chornomorsk, right? Those are being hit as well. They're even hitting the bridges that go from, for instance, Romania through Moldova into Odessa. And that is the route by which 60% of all fuel that the Kiev regime uses comes into the country. There's a couple of bridges there. The Mayaki Bridge is one of them. And Russia's just hitting that again and again and again. Now, here's the thing. We've seen this repeatedly in this conflict, is that bridges, particularly bridges built by the Soviet Union, are really hard to bring down, right? They're solid apocalypse-proof things. But Russia now has the drone capability, right? They're producing so many Garan drones a day and so many missiles, right? The production rate is going up, that they can now afford to hit something on an almost nightly basis if that's what they need to stop the use of that. So that's why they're hitting the bridges. They're even hitting the train infrastructure in the Odessa region. And they're not only cutting off Odessa, basically shutting Odessa down, but they've started doing the same thing against the Kiev regime's train infrastructure in Kiev, that through which supplies are brought in from Poland, right? They've been hitting that whole train route there again. In a way, I've heard a lot of times people ask me, why hasn't Russia gone after supplies from the West coming into the Kiev regime? Why haven't they gone after the roads and the trains? And the short story is that Russia really lacked the capability, at least to do it in a cost-effective way. Because when you're talking about things like trains and bridges, the truth is they can be rebuilt. And particularly with the trains and train tracks and stations, they can be repaired pretty quickly. The Kiev regime is good at that, just like Russia is, because they are still the remnants of the Soviet Union, in that regard. It is only now that Russia is producing so many long-range strike drones and so many missiles that they can now afford to hit these things regularly, even if they could be repaired. And it has to be said that the Kiev regime is rapidly losing the ability to repair their electrical and transport infrastructure because it's been deteriorated so much, and their own ability to repair it has been deteriorated as well, both material wise and financially. It's a new. A lot of people despair, for whatever reason, of the pace of the contact lines movement with the war of attrition. Even though intellectually they may understand that Russia's winning a war of attrition, they've become used to, I don't know, Call of Duty, Hollywood, and they want big maneuver warfare, Russia winning the war in 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. That just was never in the cards. And Russia is moving faster with the war of attrition. That is undeniable, but it's still not fast enough for some people. But if you want to see an escalation that is really happening, that is taking things to another level, that is Russia's long-range strike war of attrition right now. The way it's pounding Odessa, the way it's pounding Kiev, it is simply reaching levels that have never been seen before, quite obviously, with the numbers, the damage being done, and the damage to the electrical infrastructure, the train infrastructure, the port infrastructure. This is going to have long-term effects, sapping the strength of the Kiev regime, their ability to recover from losses on the battlefield, and so forth. It's serious, and it's happening now in a big and very noticeable way.
One last thing, we only got a few more minutes, but I did want you to comment on this. There's another that I see, and what was, a full spectrum. This is a full spectrum war against Russia. So there's one other spectrum that we need to talk about that I think is in Russia's is a strength that Russia is playing, and that is EU is experiencing both political and economic instability and deterioration. One being they're looking at, we got to figure a way to come up with more money to give the Kiev regime, and that ain't easy. So we got to try to sell some bonds. Who the hell's going to buy these bonds? The people are going to go bananas. So they've got that political instability, and they're looking at it as we talk about the long term. Well, what's going to happen in the summer and the fall? How the heck are they going to come up with money by May or June when they're out of money? And last but not least, Jacques Beau. I think that was a mistake. People all over are like, whoa, that's all over the internet. That's all over everything. That's who these people are. They're fascists, but political, economic instability in the EU, which I think, again, is to Russia's advantage. It is a full spectrum. But Russia, it's something that Russia doesn't have to do. These clowns are doing it to themselves. They can wait that out. Anyway, your thoughts on those two issues, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're living in two different realities, right? If you check on the pages of The Economist or these other, is Russia's economy about to collapse? And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about, right?
I was just in Moscow. It was fantastic. Let me say, we went to fine restaurants, Mark, and I stuffed myself full of the most delicious Georgian food. And it didn't. Did you see any of those articles about the Russians eating each other?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think they were eating each other.
Yeah, on the battlefield, they're eating it. So it's just the propaganda is getting absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, when we talk about me and Garland feasting, neither of us are extremely wealthy individuals. Had any of that, right? This is standard fare available to all Russians. But anyway, it's not Russia's economy that's in jeopardy and at risk of collapse. It's the European economies, right? Whether we're talking the UK and France, whose own ministers, right? Not me, not my propaganda, if you don't want to trust me, but the British and French finance ministers have both talked about they may need to take out bailout loans from the IMF because they're on the point of bankruptcy, right? Germany's, just type in Germany and deindustrialization. The words are practically, a collocation at this point, how often they've been put together, even in the Western press. So they attempted to, steal by way of this financial chicanery, this sleight of hand, Russia's frozen assets in Euroclear with this reparations loan. And there was enough dissension within the EU from, it has to be said, the European Central Bank, from the IMF, that put an end to that. And Euroclear itself, of course. So what they came up instead was really just a stopgap. Well, 140 billion from that would only have kept the Kiev regime alive for another year. Now, what they've settled on instead is a $90 billion loan that the collateral is actually the European common budget. And they're supposed to allow bonds to be taken out on this. Who is actually going to buy these bonds? I really don't know, because there's no solid collateral for them. And the Europeans are saying that the money they give to Ukraine will never be paid back until Russia pays war reparations. And everyone with a brain can see that Russia's winning this war and is never going to pay war reparations. They may demand reparations from the Kiev regime at the end of this. They may demand reparations from the Europeans at the end of this, right? But they're not going to be paying anyone any reparations. So I can only imagine what the interest rate would be. And actually, whether we were talking the 140 billion or the much smaller 90 billion, which it will be lucky if it lasts the Kiev regime a year, they weren't going to get either of those full sums, right? Because part of those already had to go to pay off previous loans that have been given to the Kiev regime, right? On this.
Using a credit look, that's like using one credit card to pay off the other credit card.
That's exactly what it is. It's not just like it. It is exactly what it is, right? And the interest that they're already paying on previous loans that they've given to the Kiev regime is starting to become a really significant financial burden on them. And now with this 90 billion, they're not going to be able to pay off that. They're just going to try and pay down pay off the interest that is owed. And they're just, they are literally sacrificing their own children's and grandchildren's future for a conflict that they're going to lose anyway in Ukraine. If I don't care about Europeans, I'm sorry, we're in a war. I don't. But if you are a person who cared about Europeans, well, then you could weep for them. You could weep for their future, because this is what their political elite is doing to them. They're literally putting their children and their grandchildren's futures at risk.
I don't think it's risky. I don't think this is risky anymore. I think they've thrown them in the toilet and flushed. Oh. Well, Mark Sleboda, before we go, let's remind everybody because I know everybody's like, wow, this is great. I really enjoyed this show. How can I find out more about Mark Sleboda? There is a way, isn't there, Mark?
There is. And that's at The Real Politic on Boosty, a Patreon clone, where I put all of my work that I do with everyone. And I also have lots of exclusive content every week for subscribers. There, a tiered membership, so you can get access to there if you don't get enough of me, if you don't suffer enough from me, if you're that much of a sadomasochist that you want more of me a week than you would just get with Garland, then you can get lots of exclusive content and private Discord channel to chew the fat with me and everything else there.
All right. Thanks to everybody. Especially want to thank all my Patreon members and everybody, that does the buy me a coffee and all that stuff. Don't forget, there's my P.O. box. So anybody who wants to snail mail, I got a P.O. box, and people send me all kinds of stuff all the time. In fact, this tie, somebody literally send me ties. So I'm like, you sent me a tie, I'm wearing it. All right.
You have to wonder when somene's sending you a tie, is that a comment on your tie library?
I think it is. I think it's like they're looking like, that poor bastard. I don't know why he's wearing that, but I better send him a tie to look. Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Mark Sleboda, Boosty.to. Thanks a lot. Don't forget, we don't have all kinds of important sponsors keeping us on the air. So what we need to do is for everybody that's watching to make sure you subscribe. And of course, the most important thing, which is share this. There's like 1,049 people watching. That means everybody should share this on all of their social media platforms, and the word will get out. Thanks a lot. We're out.